In this series of videos, we'll look at the causes of the American Revolution through the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which is generally considered as beginning of the war. In this first video, we will look at the impact of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening and move Americans towards revolution. Now, the Enlightenment's often called the Age of Reason, and it goes as far back in England and Europe as the 16th, 17th century, but it really didn't hit America until the 18th century. The idea was that there were natural laws that governed the universe, and before people assumed that what happened was because what God wanted. God was controlling everything that happened. The Enlightenment thinkers suggested rather that God created these natural laws and then sat back and sort of let them run on their own. And mankind, the Enlightenment thinkers thought, could study and discover these laws and use them to his own benefit. Well, that Enlightenment idea really had profound effect on who was king. I mean, the kings would justify their kingship by saying God wanted us to be here. It was called the divine right of kings. Well, if you're accepting what the Enlightenment's saying, then if God doesn't pick kings, God doesn't deal with specifics, then why are you king? I mean, how did you become king? Why should you be king? It underlines the divine right theory of kings. If divine right isn't the reason that there are kings, then why are there kings? The first person to really attempt to answer this question was the 17th century English philosopher named Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan in 1651, in which he struck down the divine right theory. And he said it was the reason we have kings was because the evil nature of man. Without a ruler, there'd be chaos, which nobody would want. There'd be, quote, scores of sturdy beggars, and there'd be swarms of idle persons if there weren't the appropriate authority. Hobbes said, quote, every man is an enemy to every other man, unquote. And so without rulers, life would be continual fear and danger of violent death, and life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, unquote. So people agreed to follow rulers because the alternative was much, much worse. The next Enlightenment thinker to address this question was John Locke, who was a generation later. Writing in the late 17th century, Locke wrote a book called Two Treatises on Government. And he said there was indeed there were natural rights, but one of these natural rights was every individual's right to, quote, life, liberty, and property. Because of this, rulers had to have a social contract with its people. And a government had to protect the natural right of life, liberty, and property. And if the government did, then the people had an obligation to follow. If, however, the king or the government did not protect these individual natural rights, then the people not only had a right, but a duty to rebel. Just a few years later, there was another philosopher and writer named Voltaire, who wrote a book called Letters on the English. And he praised the fact that, at least compared to the French, the English did a better job at protecting life, liberty, and property, better job of protecting individual liberties. And largely that was because of a limited monarchy, and they'd begun to divide power. The French had consolidated power in the king, but the British had begun to spread power out, and that was, by according to Voltaire, a better form of government. Finally, in the middle of the 18th century, there was the philosopher and writer Rousseau, and he wrote a book called Social Contract, and you can tell that obviously picked up where Locke had been talking about. Actually, he didn't have a whole bunch of new original thoughts, but what he did do was popularize Locke's social contract idea. He wrote it in better prose, clear terms, and he was also writing closer to the Revolution, which probably meant that the ideas had more of an impact. All of these Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers profoundly influenced the leaders of the American Revolution, and others who were well educated tended to be wealthier, and they were all familiar with them. One of the more famous ones was, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who had volumes on Voltaire and Rousseau and Locke in his library. Another Enlightenment thinker that profoundly affected Americans was Adam Smith, who applied natural law not to politics, but economics. He was a college professor, and he watched the growth of a market economy during the Renaissance, and he saw a growing acceptance of individual profits and sort of worked from there. He's probably one of the more famous economists ever in history. In his book Wealth of Nations, which incidentally was published in 1776, Smith argued that individual profit motives wouldn't lead to chaos, but if they're left alone, they would lead to innovation, and it would, unhindered private motive would lead to prosperity for all. And this really challenged the mercantilist assumption of limited wealth, and it sort of undermined the economic philosophical justifications for a strict British control of the American trade. Americans said, look, if you'd stop trying to control us, our economy, and our trade, then we'd all do better. They picked up for an Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. For every action, there's a reaction, the old saying goes, and that was true with the Enlightenment too. Just after the Enlightenment, beginning in about the 18th century, there was a religious revival movement known as the Great Awakening. And if the Enlightenment moved the upper classes towards revolution, then the Great Awakening moved the less well-educated and those out in the frontier, the poor, to revolution. The idea was this: the Enlightenment seemed to imply that God didn't care about the average person. God doesn't deal with a lot of the little trivia things. Natural laws determine what happens. And the implications were that God didn't care about everyday people. Well, the Great Awakening, an emotional revival movement that really spread to a number of new faiths, stressed that God did care about individual people. There was equality of souls. The backwoods frontiersman, the poor urban dweller in America was just as important as the king in God's eyes. And so if that person was being abused, it was an affront to God. And so you can see how when people started thinking the King of England was hurting small everyday people, it mattered, and they had a right to rebel. In using Enlightenment theories to make their case for independence, Americans relied on two separate political arguments, two separate political philosophies, even though, as you'll see, you really can't use both at the same time. They are republicanism and liberalism, and they don't mean what you might think they mean today. It's not about the Republican Party or liberals today that might advocate a larger government. It means something completely different. Classical liberalism was the idea that society does best if everyone is left alone to pursue his or her own best interests. It obviously takes off from what Adam Smith had said in the economic realm. But if they're left alone to pursue their best interests, then the society as a whole will improve. Now, in this view, the king wasn't really allowing the colonists to pursue their individual interests, and therefore the people had a duty and an obligation to rebel. Republicanism took the opposite view. It was the idea that society is best if everyone works for the whole, so it sort of flows from the Lockean social contract. In this view, the king wasn't working for the whole, but rather what was best for him personally. They often said the king didn't see the American colonies as part of the British whole, and because they weren't allowing, because the king wasn't working for the whole, then the people had a right and a duty to rebel. This concludes the first of these videos on the causes of the American Revolution, the impact of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening.